This is the final fourth part of this report of a playthrough of Napoleon's vast battles. And it picks up at around 3 p.m. on the 17th of June. And as night falls, the Allied forces in the west slip away from the French lines, and they leave a thin cavalry screen to hold the French back. Now, Wellington has a plan here. He will fall back to a new defensive position, actually south of Waterloo, using the wooded areas south of the Belle Alliance as a first line, with the second option then to fall back further towards Waterloo if necessary. Now, the forests in this area will slow down the French advance, they'll deter artillery bombardment, and they'll hopefully all but stop the French cavalry. Now, behind the woods, the La Lasne River in the east will also provide a bit of a defensive barrier, and if those Allied forces need to fall back, they can reform near that Mont Saint-Jean escarpment. In the very least, it's a better defensive line than they currently have. Now, over in the east, in this image, the Prussians are happy with their defensive line, and they encamp in this position for the night. They've been here for a while now, and they're feeling pretty confident that that sort of river there will help them to hold off a French assault. Now, as sun rises on the 18th of June, Napoleon wakes to find it's still raining, and the Allied forces have pulled back several kilometres to the north. He draws in his corps along the main road to Brussels in preparation for this strong drive to the north on the west there. The plan is to send 3 corps straight into the centre of the outer line, pinning them down as much as possible, then sending the guard to clear a path through, effectively charge, then pin, exploit, and destroy the Allied force. It's a little different to his plan earlier on the 16th of June, where he fanned out and tried to outflank both Allied positions, but that plan failed, so he's trying something new here. He's trying to push in force. The Allies simply have too much cavalry in the forests, make outflanking manoeuvres almost impossible in this area. In contrast, the strong French brigades bring a huge advantage in direct combat, and they can pick their target and hopefully easily bring superior numbers to the fight and destroy the Allied force. Meanwhile, however, von Bülow's Prussian corps has arrived in the east, and he's sending them directly through to the west to confront the main French force. They're going around behind that Prussian position in the east. He's sending them straight west. Now, as soon as the rain stops at about 11 a.m, this is on the 18th of June, Napoleon sends the French charging north. In the east, 2 corps make contact with the Prussians, and they manage to force their way across the river in 2 small areas. And these images show the situation after French movement, and then again after combat. Now, the Prussians respond to this by tightening their line and trying to push the French back over the river with mixed success. In the west, the Allies simply hold the line and bring up the last lot of reinforcements. At midday on the 18th of June, the French finally strike Wellington's line in the west. Now, French infantry charge en masse at Les Flamards Chateau, held by a well-entrenched Allied brigade. Despite the stalwart defences of the chateau, which gives a 3 times defence modifier, the Allied defences are eventually overcome and they're forced to retreat. Over in the east, the French throw just about everything at the Prussian line in a desperate attempt to dislodge them from their defensive position. And again, they have some mixed success. In typical fashion, both Wellington and Blucher push back at the French lines. In the west, the Allies attempt to retake the chateau, but they fail, while in the east, the bulk of both Prussian corps are engaged against the bulk of both French corps. The heavy fighting here really exhausts both sides, and the French and Prussian brigades momentarily fall back for a respite. At about 1 p.m, against both the Allied force in the west and the Prussian force in the east, the French maintain that simple strategy of striking the enemy force in the centre. In the east, there is one setback amid an array of successes, and the Allies are effectively forced back from their strong defensive positions. In the east, combat is a little bit more mixed, but the French establish a clear bridgehead over the river, and after advancing, they lock numerous Prussian brigades in combat. Wellington rushes to plug those gaps in his line, refusing to pull back just yet, and Blucher in the east responds in much the same way, and he pushes his western flank actually across the river to the south to put more pressure on that French thrust. In the west, the fighting once again leans towards the French, and Wellington's allied force is pushed even further back towards the north. While in the east, the fighting is once again a bit mixed. The French hold Mont Saint-Guibert barely, but the Prussians are pushing down hard on both of their flanks. At 2 p.m, the French once again push, this time with a broader push along most of the Allied front. Now, it's a strong move, and the French certainly use their numbers to their advantage, but along the whole front, combat goes against them, and they're again forced to pull back. Over in the east, the French continue to push the Prussians back away from Mont Saint-Guibert, hoping to drive a wedge between the two Prussian corps. The French combat failures provide a good opportunity for Wellington to counter, and he moves his infantry up to isolate selected French brigades. Combat again leans towards the Allies, and with no retreat path, French casualties quickly begin to pile up. Slightly east of Wellington's position, Bonbulot's corps arrives on the battlefield to help. Now, a similar situation occurs in the east as the Prussians begin to launch strong counterattacks with both corps on the flanks of the French in Mont Saint-Guibert. Again, combat goes the way of the Prussians. They eliminate several French units, and once again, on the outskirts of Mont Saint-Guibert, French losses in the east now mean that both of their corps here are disorganised. There's little chance of those officers reorganising their units, and thus pretty much all hope is lost for the French to break through the Prussian lines in the east. All they can hope for now is to salvage what they have left of their corps and somehow pull back from that difficult situation. This situation seemed to turn so quickly against the French here in the east. They were advancing so well through Mont Saint-Guibert. They had superiority of forces in the centre, but that well-timed and really well-coordinated Prussian counterattack on their flanks destroyed the morale of those French forces. Even worse, Prussian cavalry is starting to move around their western flank, threatening to trap the entire French force close to that river area there. At 3 p.m, the French attempt to disengage in the east, and they do so reasonably well, pulling back out of Mont Saint-Guibert. Over in the west, Napoleon continues to throw just about everything he has at the Allied line, and this time he has great success. He forces retreats along the Allied line, and by careful manoeuvring he captures several Allied infantry brigades. Now, Wellington is all but dislodged from his defensive position here. In the western side of this fighting in particular, Napoleon has pushed the Allies out into the open space. They've become disordered, and if they're not careful they can be picked off by the French. And yet still the Guards ever so patiently wait behind the French lines, waiting to be sent forward. Wellington briefly considers pulling back, but too many of his brigades are actually locked in combat. If he pulls back here, he risks losing those units and worsening his situation. And so for now, he decides to hold the line. Von Bülow's corps moves behind the Allied lines, and they'll plug any gaps that appear and slow down any French breakthrough that may occur. Now, despite being pushed back, the Allies continue to fight pretty well, and on the eastern flank of Wellington's line, he isolates and captures 2 French cavalry units, including Milhaud, their officer. In the east, the Prussians are doing very well. They're excited, and they launch attacks at the French flanks. It's time to give the French a taste of their own medicine. Mont Saint-Guibert is left largely alone, and the Prussians move down the flanks of the French army. By 4 p.m. on the 18th of June, the French situation is looking very dire. It looks like they're about to break through the Allied line in the west, but their casualties really are piling up, and they're simply not inflicting enough damage on the Allied forces. Napoleon really pins his entire campaign on that thrust against Wellington's army. He must break through. He must find a way to break Wellington's forces. At 4 p.m, with von Bülow's infantry arriving on the east flank, Napoleon decides to shift his attention even further to the west of this line. He drives his infantry again against the Allied forces, and he forces them back. In the far west, he's exposed a few small gaps, and he begins to isolate Allied infantry brigades. The French Guard also move into this area, and it looks like this may be the most vulnerable location for their exploitation. In the east, the French do manage to withdraw most of their forces from the line, but only 1 infantry brigade is stuck behind in Mont Saint-Guibert. With the battle in the east effectively won, Blucher decides to head west to take command of von Bülow's corps. He also detaches Perch and a portion of Perch's second corps, which is mainly cavalry, to shift west in an attempt to harass the eastern end of the French line near Waterloo. This lets the French off a little easy around Mont Saint-Guibert, and it means their isolated infantry brigade will survive, but it's really of little significance over here. The battle has been won by the Prussians, the French have been halted and disorganised, the French in the east pose no more threat, and so the Prussians begin to shift over to the west to fry bigger fish, Napoleon and his force. Von Bülow takes up a position on the flank of the Allied line, and allowing Wellington to shift his forces further west and north a little to reform that defensive line. With the French breaking through in the far west, Wellington tries to disengage a little bit, but the French are keen to keep right on the heels of his retreating infantry, and they continue to advance north. Now, by 5 p.m, as the sun begins to set, it casts a dark shadow over that eastern region. In contrast, it still shines brightly in the west. Napoleon thinks this might be a sign. He sends in the Guard. He's determined to break through the Allied line. So the Guard march forward and crash down upon Wellington's isolated defenders. In one of the biggest assaults of the campaign, attackers with a strength of 51 attack defenders with a strength of 8, which is double to 16 because of the town. A combined arms modifier give the French their best attacking odds of 4 to 1. Now this gives the Guard the lowest chance of causing mass demoralisation. Anything but a 6 on the column prevents their defeat and the demoralisation of the French army. Alas, fortune is not with the French as they roll a 6. Now this certainly eliminates a tough defender, but it causes 9 strength losses on the French side just to satisfy the exchange. And of course it reduces the demoralisation level of all French corps within 10 hexes, which is just about every French corps left fighting on the map. And this causes the instant demoralisation of the French Second Corps, who were really leading the charge through the Allied centre. So it's now up to the French Third Corps in orange and the Guard to continue to exploit that gap. Further west, the French eliminate an isolated cavalry and they isolate an artillery unit, which exposes a relatively lightly guarded Western Allied flank. Wellington tries to rally his men, and the British Second Corps take up a position on Hougoumont, while the Sixth Corps holds La Belle Alliance. Prussian cavalry move behind the Allied line to hold that far western flank. Now they're out of command, but they'll slow down any potential French advance. The Prussians also now hold the eastern flank of these Allied positions, and von Bülow's men have taken up a strong position near Marienstadt. Blucher is also in the area now, putting these men in command, and this allows Wellington to continue to shift his Allied forces northwest to a better defensive position. Chaz's corps in light blue now holds La Haye-Sainte in the centre of the Allied line. At this stage, the Allied western flank is shattered, it's scattered, and it's on the verge of collapse, but their eastern flank holds relatively well. Further southeast, Prussian cavalry begin to rush into the area in the hope of harassing the French rear. The question at this stage is, can the Allies hold, or will Napoleon break through to Brussels in the western side of this line? At 6 p.m, the French continue to batter that Allied line. The Prussian cavalry on the far western flank are wiped out, and the French Guard batter down more of the Allied centre. De Erlon's corps moves against von Bülow in the east, primarily in an attempt to lock down those corps and prevent them moving west. The Allied western flank, as I said, is exposed. The units in the area are locked down, and the French Guard cavalry are in an ideal position to exploit. Wellington will really have to respond fast if he wants to save this situation. Both sides are looking very weak, but the French have the initiative, and Wellington is certainly on the back foot responding to what the French do. And so Wellington, he urges his men to rush west. There's no real order to their movement. They just rush to fill in the gaps, desperate to hold back the French. Von Bülow begins to order his men to shift west also. And Allied forces are falling rapidly. British morale, in particular, is desperately low, but they're not quite demoralised yet. Prussian cavalry, as I said, is still behind the French lines. They're out of command and they can't attack, but it's the pressure that the French really don't need right now. At 7 p.m, the sun is setting even further, and Napoleon is getting increasingly desperate for a breakthrough. He orders direct assaults on La Haye-Sainte and Hougoumont, and the odds aren't great here, but until he can break through those points, it's difficult to manoeuvre around that part of the battlefield. De Erlon begins to shift west to take a more active role in the centre of the battlefield. Now, with only an hour of daylight left, though, it may be too late. The French get lucky in both of their main assaults, eliminating the defenders of Hougemont and forcing the defenders of La Haye-Sainte to pull back. The Allies really are in disarray, and Wellington is desperate. He's effectively throwing his infantry brigades in front of the French as cannon fodder, just trying to slow them down. They stand little chance of stopping the French, but they can certainly slow them down a bit. And once again, the Allied line shifts left to block that French advance. A forced British attack near Hougemont finally demoralises the British army. They will no longer be able to advance after combat, but it is of little consequence. The sun is about to set, and the Allied army remains on the field defending that road to the north. And at this stage, there's really nothing that Napoleon can do. He has really battered the Allied army, but it still holds the field. Every time Napoleon punches a hole in the Allied line, Wellington reorganises and shifts his forces and plugs that gap up. At the timely arrival of the Prussians on the east flank has allowed Wellington to rearrange his forces, and d'Erlon's lack of success in the east, which isn't quite his fault. He faced the toughest defensive terrain, which slowed his advance, but his failure meant that Wellington could free up those troops in the east and move them west when he needed. Ultimately then, Napoleon failed to break through, and he failed to destroy the Allied army. As night falls, the Allies still hold the field, albeit in a very battered condition and in a defensive stance. Even if the battle were to continue, most of the French corps are demoralised, and the Third Corps and the Guard are both right on the verge of collapse. One more hit on each will do it. So whilst tactically inconclusive, it is strategically an Allied or Prussian victory, and they hold the field. The French, really thinking back on early days, they needed to hit the Allies harder on the 16th of June during those early confrontations. Earlier losses among that Allied army would have weakened their stance on the 17th and then the 18th of June. And without those early Allied losses, the movement of several French corps from the east to the west was really of little consequence. It certainly strengthened Napoleon's attack in the west, but Wellington was still able to put up a solid defensive line and fill weak spots when needed. The loss of the two French corps in the east was also of relatively little consequence. The Prussians certainly won that battle, but it had little impact on the situation in the west. Now, perhaps an even stronger French force, he may have given von Bülow some pause before sending his corps immediately west. He didn't even hesitate in doing so, as it turned out. Perhaps he would have done so anyway and given up in the east. And so it turns out, in the coming days, Napoleon will retreat back to Paris with his battered army, with Wellington and Blucher hot on his heels. D'Erlon's corps is really the only marginally full-strength force available to the French, but French morale in general is shattered, and they're unlikely to put up much of a fight.